This civilization has been in every Civ game since Civ 2.
And this Civ is Persia, thus proving the old saying, once you go Persian, you don't want another version.
Yeah, and as many of you know, I am Persian, and Dr. Crow here is a, let's say, lover of Persian.
Yeah, Persophile.
A Persophile. That doesn't make us experts in this antiquity era Persia. We really welcome comments that add nuance and details to what we say. We love learning together as a community.
So in this video, we're going to talk about the new Persia in Civ 7, some of its abilities, some of its unique features, and the new leader, Xerxes.
Xerxes' history, where he comes from, is so interesting, so make sure you stick around for those details. Now, the first question I had is, which Persia is it? Because Persia has 3 dynasties that can fall under this time period of antiquity age. That's the Achaemenids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids, although to be fair, the Sassanids do push the boundaries of what is antiquity a little bit.
This Civ seems to be mostly based off of Achaemenid Persia.
Right. The introductory paragraph at the top of the page clearly says this civilization fell to Alexander, and that means it's the Achaemenids because the Parthians and the Sassanids come after the sacking of Persepolis.
But even though this Civ is mostly based off Achaemenid Persia, there are some differences between it and the previous representations of Persia in Civ 6.
In Civ 6, they were thinking about the foundation stage of Cyrus the Great and Pasargad, which was the capital in Civ 6. But in Civ 7, the capital actually moves to Parsa, which is the Old Persian word for Persepolis. Now, we should add a caveat here. We're mostly going to be using English words because we are speaking English, which honestly are Greek words. So I don't know if that makes sense, but there are Persian equivalent, and I'm not an illiterate Greek like that guy said. I know the Persian words, but we're speaking English. But even though Pasargad and Parsa or Persepolis are 2 different sites, they're very close to each other, and they have very similar environmental factors, like they're in arid lands, they're close to mountains so that you can bring in water using a qanat system, which is this really ingenious invention of the Persians that taps into the waters from the mountain and brings them through this underground network. And actually this transitions really well into Persia's unique feature, which is the Pairidaiza. Now, this is a feature we saw in Civ 6 as well, but the model for it, I think, has really improved.
So, Pairidaiza is an Avestan word, which means originally a walled garden. It refers to a garden complex, which in this case, as we see here, is divided into 4 parts.
And we know a lot about the Persian gardens from the Greek historian Xenophon. The other source of information are archaeological findings. The very first example we have is from Cyrus the Great in Pasargad. We do have the evidence of a bipartite garden, meaning there are 2 gardens, but probably was a charbagh, chahar meaning 4, bagh meaning garden, so a 4 garden plan based on the position of the pavilion at the head of the garden, creating an axial line of vision down the 2 gardens, making it into a 4-cornered garden. Now, why is it important that it's 4 instead of 2? Well, the 4 gardens incorporates political, philosophical, and religious symbolism, so it's really important to know where does that start.
And the 4-garden plan relates to the titles of Cyrus, including King of the 4 quarters of the world, and this symbolism will be continuously reformulated and readapted into later dynasties. So even into the Islamic period, this 4-garden layout will become enfolded into the language of the Quranic paradise, and so this notion of the garden as a symbol of rulership, of paradise, of bringing water to arid lands, continuously forms a language of kingship into the modern era.
Now, the pavilions, there is archaeological evidence for, and we also know that it was in a hypostyle hall, so meaning there are columns that support a flat roof on top. We also call this the post and lintel style. So this, we think, looks accurate for the time period, and we actually do have later Persians, like the Safavids, that copy what they see at Persepolis in the 1700s, for example, at Chehel Sütun. So even though it may look like Chehel Sütun to us today, that's because those Persians Persians were copying the Achaemenid Persians. The other side, however, has a pavilion with a dome, and I could not find any evidence of domes in Achaemenid Persia. They really start in Sassanid era.
Right. I mean, to build a dome like this, you need a mastery of vaulting and arches. And at this point, that wasn't really the style of architecture that develops more in the Roman period and Sassanid period. But here, with this image of the garden and the king as royal gardener, we can maybe talk a little bit about the dual forms of Xerxes given in Civ 7.
Right, so we have two personas. One, the base game, which is the King of Kings, but we also have his other moniker, Lord of Coins, which I don't think existed.
No, it sounds more like a Game of Thrones title. What it's referring to is that the Persian Empire was one of the first to really establish coinage rather than barter or bullion as a medium of exchange. They established gold and silver as the two metals, which will continue until 1970. But Lord of Coin is not a title that he used.
Not that we could find.
Not that we could find.
If you find this title, please let us know, but we searched and there doesn't seem to be a direct translation from any of the reliefs. I can't really make any sense of the Silk Road one. We thought was really out of place, even though Persepolis is a trading post.
Right, the royal roads, for instance, I think makes more sense because that is a unique feature of the Persian Empire that was very striking to us observers.
It's much more useful to have economic trait when you are going to war because you need gold to support your wars, and it's not too far off base. Obviously, they had lots of treasure. Persepolis has a treasury building, but I think this emphasis on coin and gold was probably more based on gameplay rather than history. I think Xerxes may have preferred a secondary title closer to a builder. We see that in a lot of his reliefs. He says, I built this, my father built this, I continued it, and his additions to Persepolis really are incredible.
Right. People may know Xerxes from the Greek sources and from the War of Greece, and that is a big part of his historical legacy. But if you look at Persian sources, the way he was depicted within Persian inscriptions, in fact, that legacy as a builder was much more emphasized.
Yes, I mean, I think there's this dual personality of the Persian king, starting with Darius already. Xerxes copies his father's inscription where he says that I am a friend of the right, of wrong I am not a friend. And maybe in direct response to the Greeks, he says, I am not hot-tempered. And so I take on these war efforts with foresight, with will. And this is not the image we get of him in Greek sources. Xerxes, in most of his inscriptions, refers to his daddy. He seems to have a daddy complex. And this is because his father comes to the throne in a very suspicious way. Basically, Cyrus the Great has two sons and a daughter, Atusa. Remember her name, she becomes important.
And so the first son rules Cambyses, but then he dies. The second son, Bardia, takes command of the empire. During this period of transition, a rebellion begins led by Darius, who will become the next Persian emperor. How does he justify dethroning Bardia? Well, he says that actually, that's not the real Bardia.
Yes, he says that's an imposter. And even his wife, who has been with him, doesn't realize that this is not the real Bardia. It's a doppelganger.
It's a fake Bardia who happens to look exactly like the real Bardia. As part of the many things that the Persian Empire invents, gaslighting is one of the new inventions of the Persians. And so he dethrones Bardia and takes control of the empire. So there's always a question of his legitimacy. What he does is he claims to be descended from Achaemenes, a very, very distant ancestor of Cyrus.
Which we don't really know if he really existed or not in the first place.
Right, because Cyrus's inscriptions never mention Achaemenes.
But this is where we get the namesake Achaemenid Empire.
And then he marries Atusa to establish that more direct lineage to Cyrus. And Xerxes, although he is not the first son of Darius, because he descends from Cyrus directly through his mother, he is put in line for the throne.
Xerxes comes to rule at a time of instability, not only because he's not the first son, but also there are rebellions going on around the empire. And so he really needs to establish his legitimacy, and we see him do that through connecting to his father. For example, in the reliefs at Persepolis, there's this really interesting image that may be Darius sitting enthroned and his son Xerxes behind him, establishing what is going to be the lineage of Darius before he dies. But we're actually not 100% certain that's what is being shown here, because the representation of kings in reliefs is done in a idealized form. As you can see, they both kind of look the same.
Right.
That's because these are not portraits, but it may also be Xerxes sitting on the throne just based off the time period this relief was completed. It doesn't quite make a lot of sense why he would show his father sitting enthroned when he's already king. Xerxes relies on his father for his legitimacy.
Right, and the invasion of Greece under Xerxes can also be read in that light. Darius left this mission incomplete. Xerxes, his job now as the son is to finish it and to punish Athens for their insolence.
Professor Maria Brosius, which we cite a lot, has a really interesting take on the war with Greece, where she says that actually Xerxes completed his mission, and we can see this through the way he depicts himself not as a despot who's trying to destroy Greece for good, rather as a ruler that is trying to punish an insolent empire.
And that's what he does, right? He burns down Athens.
What Brosius provides us is what would the Persians have looked like if we take their own sources seriously rather than just the Greek sources. Now, of course, this is a debate in the field and there are multiple perspectives on this, but this is one we thought we would highlight because, as Andrew Johnson has said, he's really interested in depicting Xerxes as not just the despotic invader that Herodotus provides us with. What does Xerxes look like through Persian ideology? And keep in mind, again, this is ideology, it's not truth, but this is how they represent themselves.
Exactly.
Right, so what's interesting to me is if they're trying to sort of depict Persia and Xerxes not as this warmongering civ, the abilities at first glance do not really do that vision justice, but I think we can go into the little bit of details of the terminology used.
For example, let's look at the unique ability of Persia in Civ 7. The Hamarana Council. Now, Hamarana just means battle in Old Persian. As far as I could tell, there's no singular entity called the Hamarana Council. I think what they were trying to do here is to show how, in fact, contrary to this notion of the Persian emperor as a singular despotic figure, there were a range of counselors, advisors, cabinet members who were drawn from a group called the King's Friends, who would advise the king on his strategy, on methods of rule, and so there's a much more distributed notion of governance.
Right, and in the civics tree, we see this expanded in the term satrapies.
Satrap means a provincial governor, but these governors had a lot of leeway in terms of how they actually operated in their province. So although every decision they made had to come with the approval of the central Persian state, within their provinces, they kind of raised their own armies, drew their own taxes, made their own laws, and this decentralized notion of governance really was a key to Persian stability.
And we see this in the ability with the increased gold for every town. The satrapies would increase a lot of taxes for the Persian Empire. Now, the term Angarium is Greek, but it actually refers to another Persian invention. If you didn't know, Persians invented a lot of things.
Right. And one of these is the postal system. So this was something that really fascinated Greek historians and writers, was this system of having very rapid messengers called pizaradish, who would travel along these routes called the royal roads. And all across the Persian Empire, you had these networks of very well-maintained roads with hostels at every day's journey. And these messengers served as a key link for communication between all the disparate provinces of the empire.
This is then balanced with the word spada, another war word.
And spada here refers to the army. The tradition kara is another word for the army. So, spada today, actually we can find its resonances in modern Persian, sepa, or for example, sepoy, as in like the British Raj.
And then the third term here is maybe the least inspired, the Achaemenid Empire. That's just the name. This should just be the name of the civ,
Right.
not an ability.
But the tradition Shahanshah refers to one of the titles of the Persian emperor, king of kings. Shahanshah, the word itself, is a Middle Persian word, so it's more Sassanid era, but the idea, king of kings, was already there in Old Persian inscriptions.
And then they also get a unique civilian unit and a unique military unit. But the civilian unit is also just a military unit.
Right.
It's a military commander. It's called the Hazarapatis. The word Hazar is similar to the modern Persian Hezar, meaning 1,000, and Pa, meaning legs. So it's the commander of 1,000 legs, which, I mean, is that just 500 men or 1,000 men?
Well, I think they're counting it as 1,000 because the Persian army was based on a decimal system. You would have have a commander of the whole army, but underneath that person was the Hazara Patis, the commander of 1,000 men.
And this decimal system is reiterated in the Immortals, which is also known as the 10,000 men.
The Immortals were the elite unit of the Persian Empire, and they were not called this because they were actually immortal.
They kind of do seem immortal here, right? Heals for a set amount after defeating an enemy unit. They were not undead.
Yes.
But when they died, they would be quickly replaced with another men. So keeping this number of 10,000 men consistent, the institution is seen as immortal, not the individual. But you've looked a little bit into their design as well here, right?
Right, so Immortals have been the unique unit for Persia in every iteration of the game, but I think the most realistic depiction from what we know was in Civ 5. Here you see they have a spear, and they had an oval-shaped shield, and in Civ 7 we get two distinct versions of the Immortal visually. We know from Greek sources that the spears that were carried by the Immortals testify to their rank. The kind of 9,000 regular Immortals had spears with silver pomegranates on them, but the elite of the elite had spears with golden apples at the bottom.
Although this is a very war-heavy Civ, there are, here and there sprinklings of their economic traits, but I wish there was also a little bit more of their cultural traits, because what Xerxes adds to Persepolis is quite incredible, and that is one of their wonders here, Gate of All Nations. I think one thing that stands out to a lot of people is this Babylonian blue, and there is some reasons for this. Persepolis and other Persian cities like Susa were incredibly polychromatic, meaning there was blues, reds, yellows. We also have evidence of some greens, but I think it just seems so garish to us now. They really pared down those colors and focus on the blues. In 2011, there were some bricks excavated from just outside of Persepolis that match pretty perfectly the gates of Babylon in both design and color, but we also have found sort of red paint on floors and ceilings, so red should be a prominent color here as well, but they stuck to the blue.
So the Gate of All Nations was a 4-column square hall, and it was designed to kind of act as a entryway into the broader palace complex at Persepolis. It was meant for foreign dignitaries, guests carrying tribute, all these officials. It was designed to really impress upon them the majesty of the Persian Empire.
And the elements that survive today are the western doorway, which was flanked by two bulls, and also the eastern doorway, which was flanked by two human-headed lamassu, which is an Assyrian tradition. However, the lamassu figure in Persepolis is slightly different than the Assyrian versions. For example, the one at Dur Sharukin, which is another wonder in Civ 7. If I put the side by side, take a moment to see if you can catch those differences. The Assyrian version has 5 legs, making it a much more mythical creature, whereas the Persian version has 4 legs, making it a much more naturalistic depiction of this creature. The wings also of the Persian lamassu tip upwards and curl, whereas the Assyrian version has a straight back. And again, this gives it a more naturalistic rendition. So these differences are so incredibly important for historians to try to understand the historical context of Persia, the connections that they have, the religious philosophies and worldviews. But in the Civ 7 version, it's not surprising these very small, subtle differences are missed, because this is, of course, a game, and there's all these difficulties that go into rendering real-life statues into 3D models. As you can see, it only has 3 legs. It doesn't even have 4 or 5. And these are probably due to the restrictions of game designing.
For sure. I mean, you only have so many pixels you can use to represent something, right? And the inscription on the Gate of All Nations actually refers to itself. Xerxes says, "This gate of all lands that I made, I did all these other beautiful things throughout Parsa, and my father did as well. We did it all through the grace of Ahura Mazda." Ahura Mazda will be known as the Zoroastrian deity. During this time, we're not quite sure if Zoroastrianism was a kind of defined religion yet, to the exclusion of other gods yet, but that'll happen definitely into the Parthian and Sasanian periods.
Right, and another reference in the aesthetics of the Civ to the religion is this statue that has a fire at the very top of it.
So I think what it's designed to represent here are the famous fire temples of the Zoroastrians. Fire has a sacred element in Zoroastrian religion because it is a kind of purification. So they don't worship fire itself, but it's a symbol of purity. Now, we don't know if during the Achaemenid period, this was actually an architectural practice yet. We have some kind of ideas that fires were kept sacred. Upon the accession of a new king, all fires would be relit. But this form of the fire temple, we don't have evidence of it from the Achaemenid period.
So hopefully you enjoyed going over all these traits with us and the aesthetics of the empire.
So if there are details or nuances you want to mention in the comments, please do leave a comment for us below. Overall, I mean, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I'm probably gonna first play Persia as soon as the game comes out. I'm not a nationalist, but I do love Persia. Let us know what you'd like to see next, and we'll see you in the next one.